In the musty chambers of Longwood House, a rat and termite-infested shanty on the island of St. Helena, a legend lay dying. The air was thick with the smell of mold and disease. His last words were not thunderous battlefield orders, but a broken whisper uttered between bouts of delirium. France, the army, the head of the army. Josephine, then silence. Hours later, on the afternoon of May 5th, 1821, the man who had reshaped Europe breathed his last. But the real horror began after his death. His body rapidly bloated, and a black liquid like coffee grounds flowed from his mouth, testimony to the internal bleeding that had plagued him for months. The stench of decomposition rose quickly, a deathly stench so strong that it permeated the curtains, the walls, and the memories of those who witnessed it. This is the stark truth, the not-so-glorious end of Napoleon Bonaparte. The remaining loyalists around him, such as Count Montholon and his valet Marchand, were given the terrible task of witnessing the autopsy. Dr. Francesco Antamarchi, in a tense atmosphere, performed the operation. Under the knife, the truth of Napoleon's illness was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. His stomach had been almost completely eaten away by a huge ulcer, with a hole large enough to slide a finger through. His liver was abnormally swollen. But perhaps the most tragic detail was not the disease, but his heart. At his last request, Napoleon's heart was removed and placed in a silver jar filled with alcohol, with the hope that it would be sent to his second wife, the Empress Marie-Louise. But Hudson Lowe, the British governor and Napoleon's jailer, coldly refused. He ordered that no part of the body be allowed to leave the island. The emperor's heart, like the rest of him, had become a prisoner. The humiliations continued. The French request for embalming was refused, leaving the body to decay rapidly in the island heat. The room was transformed into a sealed mausoleum. The windows shuttered, flowers strewn everywhere in a vain attempt to mask the smell of death. The body was placed on blocks of stone to keep out moisture, wrapped in linen, awaiting a funeral delayed by political squabbles. The image was a cruel and poignant contrast. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of power, who had crowned himself in the presence of the Pope, now lying there, a decaying corpse, denied both his last rites and his heart's desire. His death was not just a medical event. It was a political tragedy, a final and cruel display of absolute powerlessness. To understand why this collapse was so shocking, we have to go back in time, to a time when the name Napoleon D. Bonaparte was still an unknown one. But the man lying in that cold bed, a prisoner of his own decaying body, had not always been like this. He had been a storm, a torrent of almost unimaginable energy, emanating from a remote island and fueled by the feeling of being an outsider. Born in Corsica just a year after it became French territory, the boy named Napoleon D. Bonaparte had gone to military school in France as a foreigner. He was mocked by his classmates for his thick accent and his humble background as a petty aristocrat. It was this isolation and contempt that had forged a burning ambition, a steely determination to bring his mockers to their knees. His first opportunity came at the Siege of Toulon in 1793. Then an unknown 24-year-old artillery captain, Napoleon presented a bold and brilliant strategic plan. He showed that capturing the key forts overlooking the harbor would make it impossible for the British fleet to hold out. His plan was a brilliant success. Toulon was liberated, and the young captain, wounded in the thigh by a bayonet, was promoted straight to the rank of brigadier general. His spark of genius was recognized for the first time throughout France. But it was on the Italian campaign of 1796 that Napoleon's legend was truly born. He was given command of a ragged, starving, and mutinous army. Instead of empty promises, he gave them a vision. "Soldiers," he told his men, "you are naked, you are hungry. I will lead you to the most fertile plains in the world. The rich provinces, the great cities will be yours. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth." He transformed a rabble into an invincible army. At the Bridge of Lodi, he personally led a charge, a brave act that earned him the affectionate nickname Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, from his men. He returned from Italy not only victorious, but also with the unwavering conviction that he was a man of destiny. The subsequent Egyptian campaign was a testament to his boundless ambition. Despite his naval defeat, he transformed himself into a modern-day Alexander the Great. He brought not only an army, but also a team of 167 scientists and scholars. They founded the Egyptian Institute, and it was his men who discovered the Rosetta Stone, the key to deciphering ancient hieroglyphics. Upon his return to France, he skillfully concealed his military failures and exaggerated his cultural discoveries, casting himself as a hero who brought the light of civilization back home. And then, on March 18, 1799, he seized power. The coup was not as smooth as it seemed. When Napoleon burst into the Council of 500 to speak, he was booed and attacked by the delegates, with shouts of "Down with the dictator" ringing out everywhere. For a moment, the great general was at a loss. It was his younger brother, Lucien Bonaparte, who saved the day. Lucien drew his sword, declared that Napoleon's life was in danger, and persuaded the guards to dissolve the council. In a bold political stroke, Napoleon became first consul, the de facto ruler of France. From there, the path to absolute glory was clear. He rewrote the laws, stabilized the economy, and then, in 1804, staged his final and greatest act. In the Cathedral of Notre Dame, in the presence of Pope Pius VII, Napoleon made an act that defied God. He took the crown from the Pope and, instead of letting the Pope perform the ceremony, placed it on his own head. He then crowned Josephine, crowning her empress. The ridiculed young man from Corsica was now Emperor of the French, a self-appointed king, master of Europe. He seemed invincible, bending the world to his will. But at the heart of his glory, an invisible enemy had begun its own campaign, not on the battlefields, but in his own blood. He had crowned himself, defying centuries of tradition. He seemed invincible, a man bending the world to his will. But to truly understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, we must look at an enemy Napoleon could never see, an enemy that could not be defeated by artillery or battle-hardened troops. For at the very moment he reached the pinnacle of his power, a seed of decay was quietly growing in his own blood, sown in the years of turmoil that had brought him to the political stage. We must return to France in the 1790s, the period immediately following the Reign of Terror. It was a traumatized society, a republic that had just escaped the guillotine. The austerity and enforced virtue of Robespierre had given way to an explosion of hedonism and self-indulgence. The new elite, who had survived the purges, indulged in lavish parties, daring fashions, and promiscuous love affairs. Paris had become a place where prudence was considered weakness. And in this hotbed of moral chaos, disease flourished. Venereal diseases, especially syphilis, ravaged all social classes and became epidemic in the army. With poor sanitation, the absence of effective treatments, and the presence of courtesans who accompanied the troops, the disease was so widespread that it was simply called military disease. For a young, ambitious, and rising general like Napoleon, living and fighting in this environment, exposure was almost inevitable. This is the heart of the terrible mystery of Napoleon's decline, a theory that many historians still dispute, but which has some chilling, symptomatic evidence. It is believed that Napoleon Bonaparte contracted syphilis. The first symptoms appeared as early as 1797, just a year after he married Josephine de Beauharnais. He began complaining of severe headaches, skin rashes, and painful urination. At the same time, Josephine herself, who had famously had numerous lovers before meeting Napoleon, was unable to produce an heir. Her infertility was a common result of gonorrhea or advanced syphilis in women, which can cause permanent damage to the reproductive organs. It is impossible to know for sure who infected whom, but it seems that both were victims of the tumultuous times in which they lived. The danger of syphilis lies in its insidious nature. After the initial outbreak, symptoms may disappear for years, even decades. The disease enters a latent phase. The patient may feel completely healthy, while the syphilis spirochete remains silently lurking in the body, waiting for an opportunity. It does not die. It simply sleeps, a traitor coiled in the spinal cord and brain. And when it awakens, it launches a final attack, not on the skin or organs, but on the central nervous system itself. Napoleon's early symptoms eventually faded, dismissed as the stress of military campaigns or a common skin disease. He continued to conquer, build an empire, and reshape Europe. But the invisible enemy was still there. And as Napoleon's empire expanded across Europe, this micro-conqueror prepared for its final and most devastating campaign, a war not for territory, but for the mind and body of the emperor himself. As the 19th century began, Napoleon's power seemed limitless. He was first consul for life, soon to be emperor, a man who could change the laws and redraw the map of Europe at will. But while the emperor was conquering the world, the disease within was conquering him too. The syphilis spirochete, after years of dormancy, had begun its third stage attack, targeting the central nervous system. The first attacks were violent and humiliating. Beginning in 1802, the most powerful man in Europe began to suffer from terrible stomach pains. Those closest to him, such as his secretary Bourrienne, described Napoleon suddenly collapsing to the floor, convulsing and screaming in pain until he vomited. At the same time, his personality began to change alarmingly. His sexual appetite became erratic. He demanded the presence of women at all times, but the encounters were often mechanical, brief, and followed by outbursts of rage. His aides called these fits volcanic. Napoleon would scream, overturn furniture, bang his fists on walls, and then fall into long, brooding silences. As his empire expanded, so did the disease's invasion of his nervous system. The symptoms became more obvious and impossible to conceal. In 1806, he suffered a severe eye infection that lasted more than a week, a classic symptom of neurosyphilis. By 1811, his brilliant mind began to show cracks. His speech became incoherent. He issued contradictory orders, sometimes hours apart. He repeatedly accused his most loyal allies of betrayal, then forgot the accusation the next day. Doctors began to note an uncontrollable tremor in his left leg and a constant twitching at the corners of his mouth. He walked slowly, with a heavy gait, often needing someone to lift him from a chair. He complained of sharp, electric pains in his limbs, especially at night, a symptom characteristic of tabes dorsalis, the decay of the spinal cord caused by syphilis. No one dared name the illness. Courtiers blamed exhaustion. Marshals blamed the stress of war. But behind his back, they all said the emperor was no longer himself. The final betrayal of the body sealed the fate of the empire. The decisive moment came in August 1813, shortly after the Battle of Dresden. Napoleon had just won a resounding victory over the Allies. The enemy was in retreat, disorganized, and demoralized. This was a golden opportunity to pursue and destroy the enemy, potentially ending the war. But at the moment when his resolve was needed most, his body collapsed. A violent bout of stomach pain and diarrhea overcame him. He could not ride, could not stand. The commander of the greatest army in Europe lay curled up in his tent, shivering with cold despite being wrapped in many blankets. The army waited for orders to pursue, but the orders never came. The marshals begged him, but he sat motionless and refused to talk. Finally, he whispered a sentence that encapsulated his entire tragedy. "My mind resists, but my body surrenders." It was the first time his physical weakness had directly cost him a battle. The Allies had a chance to escape, to regroup, and a few months later they had defeated him at the Battle of Leipzig. The European powers might have seen a weakened emperor at Leipzig and then Waterloo, but they had not seen the real victor. The real victor was the illness that had paralyzed him at Dresden. Napoleon's final battle would not be in Belgium, but on a desolate rock in the middle of the Atlantic. After his final defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon's fate was sealed. He was exiled to St. Helena, a barren, windswept volcanic island in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe. The journey aboard the British ship was a long humiliation. The emperor who had shaken the world was now a prisoner, arriving bloated and exhausted, staring into his final prison. The island was not a place of rest. It was a tomb designed to kill hope. The man who had moved armies across continents could no longer walk through his own room. His residence, Longwood House, was a living hell. It was not a palace, but an old farmhouse located in one of the most damp and windswept areas of the island. The walls were constantly leaking, causing mold to grow everywhere. The floors rotted and rats ran rampant. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and decay, a stench of decay that had begun long before his death. The harsh environment relentlessly attacked a body already ravaged by disease, hastening his inevitable demise. But his enemies were not only disease and the weather. He faced a final battle, a struggle of wills with his jailer, the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe. Lowe was rigid, petty, and obsessed with preventing any possibility of Napoleon escaping. He imposed petty restrictions, censored correspondence, and most painfully, he refused to call Napoleon by the title of emperor, instead referring to him simply as General Bonaparte. For Napoleon, this was the ultimate humiliation, an attempt to erase the legacy and the man he had created. Stripped of his military and political power, Napoleon fought his final battle with words. He weaponized rage and defiance, and plunged into rereading and rewriting his memoirs, a desperate attempt to control the only thing he had left, his own story. While his mind fought, his body gave in. With his mobility restricted, his body began to distort horribly. The once proud marble bust gave way to a swollen face, sunken eyes, and a torso swollen with fluid. His muscles atrophied, and his legs weakened to the point where they could no longer support his weight. He had to rely on servants to walk around his room, and on bad days he could not even get out of bed. The island diet took a heavy toll on his already ravaged digestive system. The food was often poor quality, thick stews, spoiled meat, cheap wine. The water supply was often contaminated. For a man prone to stomach cancer, every meal was torture. He would clutch his stomach and stagger away from the table before finishing, and bouts of vomiting became a daily routine. His digestive system was almost paralyzed. Every bite brought him not nourishment, but pain. Imprisoned on an island, trapped in a decaying body, and tortured by his jailer, Napoleon's only hope now lies in the hands of doctors. But on this remote island, far from the medical centers of Europe, the cures they offer will only open a new circle of hell, a medical nightmare from which there is no escape. As Napoleon's body became a battlefield of unending pain, his remaining loyalists placed their last hope in medicine. They turned to doctors, the only ones thought capable of combating the invisible enemy eating away at the emperor from within. But in the 19th century, medicine was not an exact science. It was a dangerous mix of observation, ancient tradition, and false theories. For Napoleon, his doctors did not bring salvation. They brought a new circle of hell. Medicine at the time was dominated by the ancient Greek theory of the four humors. It was believed that the human body was made up of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that disease resulted from an imbalance in these humors. The goal of the physician was to restore that balance, often using the most heroic and brutal methods possible. To physicians like Francesco Annamarchi, Napoleon's condition, with its pain, swelling, and vomiting, was a case of severe imbalance, and they intervened aggressively. The medical nightmare began. To relieve the headaches and pressure in his body, they pressed leeches to his temples to suck blood. They used sharp knives to puncture his swollen abdomen to release fluids, a procedure that was painful and carried a high risk of infection. But that was not the worst of it. The main weapon in their arsenal was a wonder drug, used for almost every ailment, calomel. Calomel, or mercurous chloride, is a compound of mercury. At the time, it was considered an all-powerful purgative and cleanser. Doctors believed that by inducing violent vomiting and diarrhea, they could rid the body of bad humors and cleanse the system. And they gave it to Napoleon in ever-increasing doses. It was a cruel irony. To treat a man whose stomach was being eaten away by an ulcerous tumor, they gave him a heavy metal poison that attacked the digestive system itself. Each dose of calomel was torture. It caused violent intestinal spasms, uncontrollable vomiting, and unrelenting diarrhea, further dehydrating and exhausting his already weakened body. Instead of healing, it was poisoning him. His tongue swelled, his pulse weakened, and the blood he vomited turned black, all symptoms of mercury poisoning and organ failure. He was so weak that he could no longer keep down even water. The doctor's efforts to balance him were destroying him faster than the disease itself. When one treatment failed, doctors, caught in the faulty logic of the age, made it worse. They assumed that the disease's resistance required a stronger dose. They continued their methods, desperately looking for signs of improvement, only to be rewarded with a more rapid decline. Napoleon, who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, was now completely helpless. His body turned into a chemical battlefield where cancer fought with mercury poison. With his body ravaged from within and without, the great Napoleon's last fortress began to crumble. It was no longer just his body that was his prison. It was his legendary mind, the mind that had fooled all of Europe, that was about to become his final tormentor. Napoleon's body was a wasteland, a battlefield of disease and toxic treatments. But the ultimate tragedy lay not in the failure of his organs, but in the disintegration of Europe's greatest mind. The relentless physical pain and absolute isolation began a new assault on his last bastion, reason. The emperor, who had once prided himself on his prodigious memory and steely logic, was now sinking into a haze of paranoia, fear, and hallucination. His greatest fear was that of being poisoned. It became an obsession that consumed every thought. He, who had eaten in the saddle in the middle of battle, now doubted every morsel of food. He demanded that dishes be prepared in a strict manner, sealed, and opened only in his presence. He refused to drink from any cup that was not his own. The kitchen staff was constantly rotated so that no one could become too familiar with his habits. This suspicion may have been based on genuine rumors of assassination plots, but it was amplified to a pathological level by a brain ravaged by neurosyphilis and systemic poisoning. His room at Longwood was more than a hospital room. It had become a stage for ghosts. Guards outside regularly reported hearing the sounds of violent arguments coming from Napoleon's room at night, even when he was alone. They heard him shouting orders to unseen enemies or arguing with ghosts of the past. The commander of the great army was now fighting armies in his own mind, battles he could never win. His judgment, once his greatest weapon, had eroded. His temper, already erratic, had become unpredictable. He lashed out at his most loyal companions, those who had given up everything to follow him into exile. He accused them of treachery for imagined mistakes, fired trusted doctors, then hours later forgot his rage. The man who had once been able to remember the names of thousands of soldiers and the details of countless maps now struggled to maintain a coherent train of thought. He had lost the ability to command even his small, loyal court. When reality became too painful and chaotic, his mind began a final retreat into the past. He spent hours staring at the wall, not saying a word. Witnesses said he would sometimes whisper the names of his greatest victories: Austerlitz, Marengo, Jena, as if trying to cling to glorious memories when everything else was falling apart. And in his last moments of consciousness, his mind returned to a single name: Josephine. He, who had divorced her because she had failed to provide him with an heir to consolidate the dynasty, was now haunted by her image. Her portrait was always placed beside his bed. His servant Marchand recounted that he would often take the gold snuff box that Josephine had given him, press it to his lips, and whisper something indistinct. And then his last intelligible words before he fell into delirium were finally her name. The man who had sacrificed his love for the empire, in the end, when the empire was lost, was left with only the memory of his love. His body was a wreck, and now his legendary mind had followed. All that remained was a name and a fading collection of memories. The stage was set for the final and most ironic act of his life: the fate of his body and the legacy he had fought so hard to build. Napoleon's body, dissected and sewn up, was dressed in his familiar military uniform. But now it was an empty shell, hanging limply from a body ravaged by disease and decay. The man who had once commanded empires could no longer dictate the fate of his own corpse. The funeral finally took place on May 9th, for days after his death. It was a solemn ceremony, but one filled with bitter irony. The British provided a simple coffin, and loyal Frenchmen lined it with tin, a last-ditch effort to protect the body from decay. He was buried under a willow tree in the Geranium Valley, a quiet spot he is said to have chosen himself. But the greatest irony lies in the tombstone. The French, led by General Bertrand, wanted to engrave a single name, a name that shook the world: Napoleon. But Governor Hudson Lowe, in a final act of pettiness, insisted that the full name be engraved: Napoleon Bonaparte, thus reducing him from an emperor to a general. With neither side willing to budge, they reached a bitter compromise. The tombstone would be left blank. And so, one of the most famous men in history was buried in an unmarked grave. The man who had spent his life carving his name into history now had no name on his tombstone. The irony of fate did not end there. Napoleon's greatest legacy, his lifelong obsession, was to create a lasting dynasty, passing the empire on to his son. But the tragedy was even more bitter than an anonymous grave. His only legitimate son, Napoleon Francois, who was born King of Rome, lived a tragic life. After his father's defeat, he was sent to the Austrian court, living as a prisoner in a gilded cage. He was known not as a prince, but as the Duke of Reichstadt, and died of tuberculosis at the age of 21, without ever having sat on the throne. The dream of a Bonapartist dynasty died with him. And finally, the political irony. After the fall of Napoleon's empire, power in France passed not to his son, but to his enemies. The Bourbon monarchy, which the French Revolution and Napoleon had overthrown, was restored. King Louis XVIII, the brother of the beheaded king, was restored to the throne. The entire political edifice of Napoleon's life was reversed. His grotesque death was a stark reminder of the limits of power. The man who had declared himself emperor was defeated by stomach ulcers. The man who had redrawn the map of Europe to create a dynasty died without an heir. The man who had lived for glory was buried beneath an empty stone. His end was a brutal illustration of the rebellion of the body against the will and the absolute indifference of nature to human ambition. Napoleon's true legacy will lie not in his blood, but in his laws, his battle maps, and the very legend he so carefully constructed. Perhaps the most profound lesson of Napoleon's death is that not even the will of a giant can rewrite the biological laws of decay. The man who crowned himself cannot uncrown the crown of decay. His death marked not just the end of a man, but the dissolution of a revolutionary legend. Dying alone in exile transformed Napoleon from a political tyrant into a mere human being, wrote the French historian Jean Tollard. His transformation from a young general with volcanic energy to a bloated, disease-ridden exile is one of the most haunting examples of how ambition, stretched beyond its limits, can turn against itself. The dissonance between public image and private suffering mirrors the fate of many great rulers. The death of Napoleon Bonaparte was not just a political event, but also a mirror reflecting the myth of heroic endurance. As his muscles failed and his mind disintegrated, so did the illusion of imperial immortality. In the end, he met the same fate as the peasant soldiers he had once sent into battle. The story continues to fascinate us, not because of the victories he won, but because of the fragility from which he could not escape. Napoleon's horrific death reveals not just how empires fall, but how individuals fall.